Educational Communications and this station present Environmental Directions with Nancy Pearlman. On this series, we explore the effects of human influence on the Earth's ecosystems and discuss solutions to environmental problems which affect the quality of life on this planet. Environmental Directions gives you the kind of information you need to help you participate in decisions impacting your community, the nation, and the world. Now, here's your host, Nancy Pearlman.
Hello. My guest is DavidTrubridge. He is owner and director of DavidTrubridge in New Zealand. He is an artist and designer who has received the John Britton Award, which is New Zealand's highest design award. And he is an officer of the New Zealand Order of Merit. Welcome. It's a pleasure to have you with us.
Thank you, Nancy, and it's great to be here with you.
You are involved in trying to bring nature into our built living environment. You focus on something called fractals in nature. What is that?
The scientific explanation of fractals are that they are patterns that repeat themselves at regular scales. So if you look at a tree, you see the pattern of the trunk, and then the branches, and then the twigs, and then the leaves, and then the cells. And they keep on repeating as you go down in scale. And scientists have developed a way of measuring what they call fractal density, which is like if you took a pencil or a piece of paper and started scribbling patterns on it. When you start at the beginning, its fractal is 1, there's nothing there at all. And by the time you finish and covered the whole paper with black, the fractal density is 2. What we see mostly in nature around us is around about 1.3, 1.4, a bit more maybe. That's the sort of average density of fractals that we are used to seeing in nature. And the point about fractals being related to design is that as a species we evolved in the forests of Africa probably for millions of years, living in that sort of pattern density of forest. And so it's second nature to us. If you take us now out of that environment which we've evolved in and put us into cold white boxes that architects love to design, we're not actually very happy in that environment. Scientists have proved that if you create patterns on the walls of our living spaces which are similar to the same fractal density as nature, then we have the least stress levels apparent in our brains, and they measure these with electrodes attached to our brains. Fractals are good for us.
Just from personal experience, I know that I want to see nature even when I'm indoors. I want to have windows, and studies have shown that students function better when they are in buildings where they can look out the window, that it's not distracting.
That's right. And not just function better, but are happier, are more productive. A University of Rochester study discovered that people are more community-minded, more generous, and more empathetic when they can see a lot of nature or those sort of patterns. If they can't, they become more self-obsessed with their own status and their fortunes and their fame. It does skew the way in which we relate to the world around us.
You're supportive of the work of Professor Richard Taylor, who explored fractals and pointed out that, according to him, fractals are patterns that repeat at increasingly fine-sized scales, and they are prevalent throughout nature's scenery, and that the human visual system has adapted to these prevalent natural patterns. It truly is such that we want to see a variety of patterns and multiples of patterns, not just a simple geometric design.
That's right. And I think if you sit and look at a wall of tree, is less interesting if you've got big trees and little trees and big leaves and small leaves and a variety. And what Richard's also discovered is that when we're looking at those kind of views, the movement of our eyes are fractals in themselves. There's lots of little movements within a small area, then we'll jump to another space and we'll look at little movements around that area. If you record those eye movements, they become fractals as well.
As an artist and designer, you have created something called a coral light and a solar light. These look like light fixtures, round with lots of different patterns in them. Could you describe them to us on radio, since we can't see the picture?
Yeah, mostly they're spheres or similar kind of forms, sort of round forms. And what I discovered is that if you use a very thin piece of plywood and you cut it into like a shape like your hand with lots of fingers, you can independently bend each finger onto the surface of a sphere. You can't take a sheet of paper and bend that sheet onto the surface of the sphere because it can only bend one direction at a time. And so obviously the same with the plywood. But if you cut it into little fingers, then you can bend it in all directions. And so by clipping these hand-shaped shaped pieces together in sort of geometry, you can create a sphere or any similar kind of form. And that was my sort of discovery that I've then exploited through these lights. And you can basically, with computer design, you can create any pattern, any shape you like, and spread it out over the surface of a form and create these lights, which in themselves are throwing patterns on the walls and ceilings, similar to the sort of patterns we were talking about, the fractal patterns of nature.
Describe the difference between a biophilic design and a biophobic design.
Biophilic design recognizes the processes of nature. It's been taken to be used to describe green walls mostly. People sort of think of biophilic design as bringing nature indoors literally, planting green walls or having trees in your workspace, which is lovely, and we do that as well. That's great. But that's not the true depth of the biophilic design. What you're really trying to do with biophilic design is reproduce the processes of nature. The difference is that our concept of design in the West is I call it an external imposition. It's the architect creates this thing which he drops down from on high onto the land, this sort of concept which is evolved in his usually head of this sort of object which doesn't really connect to where it's being put. Whereas biophilic design works from bottom up. It grows. The architect is an enabler rather than an imposer. So he allows stuff to takes what's all there and organizes it and forms it, and out of the community, out of the people and the use and the space and the environment and the land, all that grows into the form which comes out of the land in a quite different sort of way.
You're based in New Zealand, and I always think of that country as a beautiful mountainous area, but it's an island, so it has a lot of coastline. What are the unique natural features that have inspired you from your environment in New Zealand versus that of designers and architects in other parts of the world?
I'm not sure there is a unique New Zealand design element that inspires me. I love the landscape, the natural world, wherever I am. I've walked a lot in America, in your wonderful parks, and from Alaska right down to, and also in Mexico. It's nature in general that I love, and it's the details of nature, the kind of patterns and structures and growth forms. You can't sort of draw a direct line between product or design which I've done and something which I've seen in nature. It's much more kind of subliminal than that, and I'm picking up on everything I see around me, and it's that sort of general sense of the infinite kind of complexity and beauty of nature that everywhere that's kind of forming my design process.
Whenever I walk in the forest, in the natural areas, I look at the beautiful shapes of the trees, the boulders, everything around me. But what always amazes me is how I look at some of these branches or rocks and I see other images of animals or something else other than just what it is. Is that natural?
Absolutely. I think that's you interacting with that wonderful environment, and rather than just sort of skipping past it in a car at 60 miles an hour and looking, oh, isn't that beautiful, and chatting on the phone to somebody at the same time. You're there, you're immersed in it, and you're responding to it. And that's what I think we lack in today's world, and we become so superficial, and we don't build that deep connection of just meditating in a space, and out of that process will come, sometimes fanciful things you'll see or ideas will come to your mind or whatever. What people have lost today is access to the subconscious. We live in a very superficial world, and it's like being on the surface of water where everything is beguiling and glittering and sparkling. You think that's all there is. But if you take a deep breath and sink, there's a whole other world down there. You sink into this deep blue, calm beauty, rays of light sort of zooming down into the depths below you. And this is your subconscious. And this is where people connect with each other, with communities, with society, with nature, with everything. And this is where stuff happens. And if you spend all your life on the surface, you don't make those connections deeper down in the subconscious where creativity really grows. You come out of the space in the depths with some kind of little incipient idea, which is just a seed, which you bring back to the surface. And here, as a designer and a creator, you work on that and bring it to fruition in some form as a finished design.
New Zealand was colonized by Europeans, but yet the Maori, the Polynesian indigenous people, were there for thousands of years before that. Have you found that design characteristics are incorporating both of these traditions? You have talked about the design as a colonial imposition, and there's a colonial mindset. What is that?
I'm in the position where I was born in England in the 50s. So I was born into the remnant of the British Empire, the colonial period, and when Britain was sort of thought it was something special. And I escaped that and came to this similar sort of island on the other side of the world, which is totally different because it was originally populated, as you say, by Polynesians who've been here several hundred years before the Europeans arrived. So I've been able to see both sides of it. And it's allowed me to sort of step back a little bit more, perhaps, than many people who are more immersed in it, and see just how much that colonial way of thinking of we have this, some people would say, God-given right to go into the world and develop it and use it for our benefit, irrespective of whether there might be people there already. That actually creates a sort of a mindset which continues on into too much of our daily lives without realizing it. And I see that here in New Zealand, that colonial mindset still exists in many of what we call the Pākehā, the European or the non-Maori people, who still persist with that attitude. And in my opinion, it's still there in design, this kind of sense of imposition of the designer knows what's right and places their brilliant idea onto the landscape. Whereas the Polynesians are much more community-minded. They do everything together. They're not individuals at all. Individuals who stand out are kind of brought back into the fold by, you don't do that. You don't do something different. You do something together with all of us. So they build their whole culture around their community, around the people. And that's quite different. And I try to, in the design process that I talk about here, try to sort of recognize that difference and say, well, actually, maybe there's something in it which we should be listening to, especially when we start talking about environmental design, because that colonial mindset has been terrible for the planet, whereas generally indigenous peoples are much more balanced in the way they live in relationship to nature. So I think it's a great lesson for us to learn there, and I love listening to those stories of the Maori, which they can offer us here.
Indeed. As an artist and a designer, you have incorporated nature into your work. You recognize the importance of doing so, and there are other aspects other than just seeing the beauty of nature, and studies are showing that having nature close to us can help both our mental and our physical health. And you also reference the Japanese tradition of forest bathing. What is that?
It's a gorgeous thing which is very different to our world. In the Japanese tradition of Shinrin-yoku, they love to go into the forest, as they say, bathe in the atmosphere, but not just the atmosphere, it's the physical atmosphere as well, because there's lots more oxygen generated by the leaves, by the trees, which when you're breathing is much better for you. So you're breathing really good air. And then there's that psychological impact of being in the forest as well. So the combination of the physical and the psychological.
You have been creating some beautiful work. Can we see any of it here in the United States? I think you have your coral lights at the Atlanta Ignition Center.
You can actually see that there's a lot of them all over the place, yeah. Elements Hotel has them, and we've done lots and lots of installation in offices.
Of course, one can see some of your wonderful work at your website.
Yep, www.davidtrubridge.com, and Trubridge has only got one E at the end. And there's a video there which you can watch as well, which is kind of my inspiration videos. I'm walking across the landscape in New Zealand to get a feel for the landscape where I live, and also I go out in the water. I love stand-up paddleboarding and windsurfing, and there's some video shots of me doing that, because the sea is also a really large part of my world and where my ideas come from. And that video talks about what I call the creative process, where the ideas come from, specifically in relation to the nature of the land that we live in here.
You are an officer of the New Zealand Order of Merit. What is that?
It's an honor which is bestowed by actually the Queen of England in her birthday honors list every year. She will, obviously advised by her local advisors, give out these honors to people who, I guess, merited it in what they've done through the course of their lives.
I want to thank you so very much for reminding us that nature has to be part of our daily lives, indoors and outdoors. Thank you for being my guest.
Thank you, Nancy. Thank you for inviting me.
I have been speaking with DavidTrubridge, who is owner and director of DavidTrubridge and is an artist and designer. I'm Nancy Perlman. Thank you very much for joining us, and do tune in again next week.
If you would like free information about these environmental issues, go to www.ecoprojects.org or call 310-559-9160. Environmental Directions with your host, Nancy Perlman, is a community affairs program of the nonprofit organization Educational Communications and this station.